You know, the national COVID pandemic exposed a lot of things. There are many fissures that exist in our society, but none more so than in education, where the fear of the virus led to lockdowns and remote learning, which had their own dramatic effects, to the students. But, you know, there hasn't been a lot of data on how these lockdowns affected. Now the first reports of the damage that was caused is becoming apparent. Not the anecdotal statements, but statistically. In the first full-scale assessment of 9-year-olds since the pandemic, a report found a widening achievement gap between students of color and white counterparts. More shockingly, the report exposed that reading and math scores sharply declined in all grade levels. Mike, this has to be very worrisome for you because you're on the board of Montgomery College, and that means that the students that are matriculating and going to Montgomery College may not be ready for your programs. How to cure this?
How do you cure this? I don't know that there's a cure. And I suppose on the positive side, we've seen this pervasive across the entire country, which means children need much more intensive engagement early on in their learning years, and that's very clear. And so I think if anything, it teaches us that we've got to continue to double down and make sure we're doing what we're doing prior to 3rd grade to make sure those students have the tools that they need. One of the things that we at Montgomery College have done and really worked hard at over the last 4 or 5 years is really trying to understand where our high school students are coming from and better meeting them where they're at. And so to really understand what is the quality of student, what's the caliber of student, what are the things that they know, really using their transcripts to understand where they're coming from and being able to be more malleable in the programs that we can provide at the community college level to help bridge that gap. We've realized that students don't come to Montgomery College or to community college in general to not be successful. And so we've got to be able to help get them where they are, provide them the tools they need early on. And if they need help in reading, they need help in math, getting them that, and then allowing them to be more successful in their college career, because that's costing them money, that's costing them real dollars. We want to make sure that they can get through the other end, ultimately get the job they need and be contributing for themselves and for the broader community.
What I'm hearing you say is that the Montgomery County public school system is failing these students and not educating them properly.
No, and that's not. I don't think it's not a failure. It's a recognition that we had 2.5 years that we couldn't provide education in a way that people learn how to provide education. And unfortunately, we see this across the entire country. And so I think the school system is trying to figure out how to remedy that and put tools in place. But that doesn't mean that there's still not going to be a cohort of students that are still going to have those challenges that travel with them. And so I think the educational system as a whole has got to recognize that and be able to provide the tools to help those students over that 2.5-year gap that many of them missed.
Well, but if Mark, I'm going to give you this question, because if Montgomery County is having to devote a lot of resources to bring students up to par for them to be successful in their programs, that means there's a huge number of students in our system that aren't being properly educated. And what this report suggests is that we may need to send them all back for another year of schooling. Is that the answer?
Well, I don't know it's a complete gap here. Let's talk about kind of the broader issue, which is there's a real contrast in the philosophy of the way education should be conducted. And on one hand, we have sort of the Kerwin-Thornton tradition of, let's provide more resources, so that it's basically the structures and processes are in place. They just need to be funded more. Mike referenced early education as being one of the additional pieces to that. And that stands in contrast with an approach that involves sort of breaking up the one size fits all, the sort of factory school model in which the assumption is that students all learn in the same way. And that really would involve more in the way of choice, more in the way of a diversity of approaches for education. And there's a choice there. I mean, if you look at Wes Moore and you look at Dan Cox, that's an area in which on education and educational choice is a sharp contrast.
So, Mike, we haven't seen the same level of acrimony as exists across the river in some of the in Fairfax County and in the Loudoun County school systems. But there is a question as to whether or not the schools are spending sufficient time on the basics of education and rather on social programs. What's your answer to this?
No, I think, well, I think, yes, they are focusing on the basics. I think we've got to continue to double down on those basics, because I think, as you reported with the statistics earlier, we've got a lot of catching up to do, because students haven't had that 2-year hiatus, because they were effective. Many of them were online, but it clearly didn't have the same impact as actually being in person, which we knew was a reality. And so I think that personally, I think that the notion of we're focusing on social programming has been a great red herring for the folks in Virginia, and I think allowed Governor Youngkin to go into the governor's mansion. But I really I think the focus is on teaching kids how to learn and recognizing the world in which they're learning.
So, Mark, you mentioned the factory model of education. And in many ways, the public school education system was founded around the turn of between the 18th and 19th century. So it's more than 100 years old. Is it time for a change? There are those that advocate a completely free market solution where that all public education should be handled by the voucher system, that every kid who wants to be educated should get a voucher. It can go to a school of their choice.
Well, there are a variety of approaches. Obviously, charter schools are permitted in Maryland, not so much in Montgomery County. There are a variety of ways in which you can provide for the fact that students have different learning styles. And that's something that really needs to be incorporated to a much greater extent in our.
But also motivation. I mean, a lot of this comes from parental activity and parental motivation. And so shouldn't those parents who want and demand better educations for their children have that opportunity than being locked in the public school system?
Absolutely. I mean, I think there should be more choice. And I would point out the way MCPS operates, the assumption is that parents are going to supplement their kids' education to a substantial degree.
Mike, I'm going to give you the last word because I know I hit a nerve with you.
That's okay. I think vouchers are actually an interesting approach. The reality is we have 165,000 students in Montgomery County. And I think from a private school perspective, I think they teach about 6,000 students in the private school. So vouchers aren't going to get very far to try and make sure that we can actually bridge that gap. So we've got to figure out how do we continue to teach our children better.
Well, I'll let you have the last word. This is for the 20 years that we've been on the air, we've been talking about the Montgomery County public school system on a continual and regular basis. And I'm sure we're going to in the future. Stay tuned for parting shots.